Welcome to Grim Captivation, a paranormal podcast. Now, although I'm going a little off schedule, so to say, today I will be telling you all about my own paranormal experiences. I thought it'd be a great way to kick off the ultimate spooky season of October with some true ghost stories. So, whether you believe it or not, I'm here to tell you about the experiences I've had in the past that have really impacted me in pursuing the otherworldly and the spiritual realm. Let's get into it. Witnessing my first ghostly apparition was not fun. I was in my sophomore year of high school and living in a small town in south central Iowa. My house was out in the country, where our neighbors were at least half a mile from either side, and my house was next to a nearly abandoned gravel road to one side. This road stretched for a few miles up and down rolling hills, covered with thick forest on either side. Of course, being in the middle of nowhere, there were no lamps or lights for this road to be lit. Also along this road was a broken down bridge, where half of it was demolished and where I could venture down to when I had free time in the summer or after school and got bored. Whenever I visited this location alone, I always had a sense that something or someone was watching me. This tense sensation of paranoia steadily increased whenever I walked back home on the lonely gravel road. Something was always off about the road. It was only about 1 or 2 a.m. when I woke up to my first visual apparition. I hadn't slept well at all that night, and it was after a day that I had visited the bridge from the road. I woke up feeling a little off, and had a strange lure towards the window and to look out of it. I never did this normally, and never during the night. However, that night, I seemed to be pulled towards it. Peering out of the window, I could see the road, or at least partially, since some of the tree branches and leaves covered most of it. On the road stood a single figure of a little girl. She wore a white dress that waved ever so slightly, was barefoot, and had long black hair. The scariest thing about her, though, was that she was staring directly at my window. Now, this road was hundreds of feet away and hidden by a small hill and forestry, so the distance was pretty long. But her gaze was directed towards me, her shadowed eyes looking at the exact window that I was oddly directed to. I closed the curtains for a few seconds with my heart beating fast, and turned on the lights. I didn't sleep at all the rest of that night, and never dared to look out of the window. But this apparition wouldn't stop there. She had seen me, and locked onto my location. It would be another month before I saw her again, but this time she was much closer. Waking up around 2 or 3 this time, the moment I opened my eyes, I saw her. She was on the opposite side of the room, standing near my closet. Within the darkest shadows of the corner, she stood completely still, but always staring at me, with her head bent down slightly. There was a small window behind where the wind came through, and rustled her black hair. It was the same entity I saw on the road a month before. I was absolutely sure of it. There was a moment of frozen terror. My eyes were wide open with absolute fright. Keeping my focus on her, I stumbled my hands over the wall and behind me before flickering on the room lights. When I did, I briefly, for just a split second, looked away to find the light switch, and when I turned it back, the apparition had disappeared. Once again, I didn't sleep at all that night. As so it happens in the paranormal field, the number 3 comes up a lot. It has its own meanings for some, but for me that year, it would mean a third time for this entity to reappear. This time it was the scariest. Again, around 2 or 3 a.m., I was beginning to wake up, and I was in an almost half-conscious state, but I couldn't wake up. This same terrifying entity was suddenly in front of me, and on top of me. She had very pale skin and dark eyes, almost completely black. She was screaming at me with an extended jaw, but no sound came out. But the anger in her eyes was fierce, and her open mouth only had blackness within. My wrists and ankles felt as if they were pinned down and I couldn't move. I felt my body writhing back and forth for escape. I shut my eyes and tried to scream too, but nothing came out either. Suddenly, I felt the weight shifting off of me, and I tumbled down to the ground with a big thud. I didn't know how long I laid there, because when my mother came up to check on me, she said that she had heard a bump in the night, but didn't bother to check on it since it came from my room. I told her that I had fallen out of bed unknowingly, but didn't bother to explain the reason. I knew they wouldn't believe me, and so I stayed quiet. Strangely enough, this entity never returned after that night. I wondered what happened that night and why it never came back. For years it puzzled me until about last year when I talked with a medium, where she explained that a guardian angel might have fought with this demonic entity and had shoved this apparition off of me so I could escape its grasp. Now, I'm a paranormal believer when it comes to entities like demons and angels, so it makes sense to me coming to that conclusion. Ever since then, I've had multiple other experiences of seeing and sensing spirits. Perhaps it was this initial occurrence that opened my third eye to the spiritual realm, both from malevolent and benevolent entities. However, no matter how many times I revisited that broken down bridge, the sensation of always being watched over there never went away. Was this a sort of paranoid sense that I continued, or was this something that was really watching me? I can never be too sure. The next few spirits that I saw were brief, and when I was still living in Iowa, attending a community college, so it wasn't too long after the first occurrence. The first very quick happening was when I was driving back from college to my parents' house. At the time, the college was nearby, and on the weekends I'd drive back home. It was around 9 p.m., and I was the only driver on a stretch of the highway. When I went underneath a bridge, a sudden figure of a farmer with overalls, a red plaid shirt, and thick black boots appeared directly ahead and to the right of my car. I slammed on my brakes and swerved a little to the left in a panic. But when I looked back in the rearview mirror, the figure was not there. I almost expected a quick thud when I drove past him, but nothing was heard. It was a strange thing to see, but who knows if this was a real apparition, or just a case of me being tired and driving alone at night. The next time I saw spirits was a few months after the driving incident. I was still in college, and it was around October when some of my classmates and roommates mentioned that there was a supposed haunted cemetery out in the middle of nowhere. The rumor went that two brothers had died unjustly almost 100 years ago and were buried together because they had such a close bond. Knowing that I had seen a couple spirits before, a group of my college friends, about 5 of us, drove to the cemetery at around 11 p.m. We planned to stay there until midnight to see if anything spooky happened after that time. When we got there, it was as exactly as they had told me, in the middle of nowhere. Lines of headstones were nestled away in a small valley between a hill and the borders of a thick forest. One main gravel road started from the main road and led up to a large statue of an angel. The cemetery grounds weren't too big, but the land itself wasn't full either. It was halfway filled up. I always wondered if everyone stopped burying people there because it was too far, or because of something nefarious. I didn't share my thoughts with them as we got out of the car and stepped into the chilly air. Taking out our phones, we tried recording the entirety of the cemetery, calling out to any spirits to make themselves known. Nothing was seen that night, but when we asked the spirits to make a noise, 3 knocks against one of the stones was made. Barely heard, but it was clear that there were 3 knocks. Most of the group darted back to the car immediately upon hearing it, but I walked back and looked to my right where some of the forest was. I felt an uneasy aura coming from it, but continued to head back to the car, where we drove back in a panicked excitement. But this wasn't the only time I visited the cemetery. A small group of friends wanted to go back again, and I happily obliged. I wanted to see the 2 brothers. It was probably a couple weeks after the first visit, and we were all curious about it. This time, we arrived at the cemetery around 11:45 so we could stay well past midnight. Again, we asked the spirits to make themselves known, and this night, they would. There were a few thumping sounds like last time, but nothing too clear, and we didn't really catch it on our phones. We had stayed there for about an hour when we decided to head back. Upon walking back to the car, I heard a faint whisper to my right and paused for a moment. I wasn't sure exactly what it said. I continued my way forward, but looked back out of curiosity. There, where I had just heard the whisper, were the silhouettes of 2 figures. One stood perfectly still, dressed in a waistcoat and a hat, while the other darted from one tombstone to the other, like a kid playing hide-and-seek, his back hunched over as if he was hiding from his brother. I knew it to be the brothers. It had to be. It was then that I heard a "thank you," supposedly coming from the brother, in a quiet whisper before it faded away into the mist. I was absolutely stunned. Did this really happen? Was I the only one to see these apparitions? Apparently, that was exactly what it was. I told the group about it, and they were all just as shocked as I was. None of them had seen the brothers. I returned back to campus in a startled yet satisfied mood. Peaceful spirits are the ones everyone wants to meet, and I had just done that. A few years later, I moved to Illinois, and where my then girlfriend and now wife had spirits of her own that resided in the townhouse that she lived in. For the most part, the most repetitive apparitions were two ghosts of a little boy and girl. Almost everyone had either heard them or seen them throughout the house, from the bedroom to the kitchen to the basement. The first time that I heard and sensed them was when I was sleeping in the basement for a weekend night. I couldn't sleep that night because I continually sensed that someone was standing behind me, at the edge of the bed. The other side of the bed was wedged up against a wall, so whenever I turned to the wall, the presence was standing behind me, breathing in a steady rhythm. I could feel their eyes staring at me. Whenever I rolled over, nothing was there, and the noise of the breathing stopped. It was in a different night where I actually saw the eyes that stared at me all night, hiding inside a pile of laundry. It was the little girl that they kept telling me about. I could see her eyes and the top of her head with black hair to the sides. She didn't move, she didn't say anything, only watched. Another night, I would see the little boy when I was sleeping in the living room, where one of the walls had windows to the patio. At first, when I wasn't sleeping again, I thought it could have been the dogs making noise from the patio, but when I heard a chair move briefly from the kitchen, I looked over, and there in a large mirror was the reflection of a small boy with black hair, looking directly at me. But the spookiest thing about this was that there was no one sitting at the chairs that were directly in front of the mirror. I couldn't stare at him for too long as I rolled over and decided to watch videos until I fell asleep. I knew there was no other option. Spirits were there to watch everyone in the house, but apparently nothing else. Apart from those two creepy incidents, these mischievous spirits would move things around. Little things like clothes or silverware, or would occasionally wiggle the doorknob to the basement bathroom. It ultimately happened to me a few times when I was in the bathroom and the doorknob moved, as if someone was trying to get in. When I called out that I was inside, no response was made, but the knob continued to move. When I got out, no one had been in the basement the whole time. I would have known too, because the stairs made a lot of noise when someone walked up and down it. Curiously, that too was a common thing in the house. And not only that, but my wife's entire family had their own personal scares during their time at that house. But I won't be discussing their stories here, only the few times that I've had paranormal experiences there. In the apartment that my wife and I currently live in, there haven't been too many events that have happened, mostly because we pray often, light sage and incense, and overall tend to not bring any negative energy into the place. With that being said, we still have seen a few shadows here and there, dashing in the hallway quickly or peeking from around a corner for a split second. Nothing has been clearly heard or identified, because each time we report something to each other, we make sure to cleanse the space. Lately, I woke up from not sleeping well and saw a tiny face in the reflection of our turtle's tank. Because the tank has an underwater heating tool that has a glowing red light, the face in the tank glowed red as well, giving a rather ominous glare to it. But when I reached to turn on the light, the face was gone. Since then, nothing has really happened, but perhaps even by speaking about residual hauntings, it could provoke any spirits to come and make their presence known. These are all the paranormal experiences that have had an incredible impact on me throughout my life. Whether you believe it or not, it's always up to you. I decided to share my stories because it's kind of good to have an open mind about the paranormal and supernatural. Entities, good and evil, they do exist, at least they do in my opinion. Spiritual battles happen each and every day, whether we see or feel it or not. The decisions and choices we make, the actions we perform, and the thoughts we have day in and day out. These all can truly impact whether or not we can be closer or further from the supernatural. So what are your thoughts on the spiritual realms and the paranormal? Let me know. Once again, this is Grim Captivation, and I hope you all enjoyed my own personal spiritual stories.